A billionaire always lives in anticipation of disaster, but not in the form of a stock crash or a raider attack, but as a sudden revelation of that fragile, plaster idol you have painstakingly molded yourself into all these years. I was standing at the panoramic window of my penthouse, which hung over Manhattan, looking at the lights that symbolized my millions of decisions and compromises, when there was a knock on the door, not the knock of a guard or an assistant, but a sharp, alien, almost police knock that instantly froze the blood in my veins, because such sounds simply do not exist in my world. It was an unexpected, unprecedented event, and when I opened it, I saw not a person, but a gray envelope, thrown directly on the carpet in front of the door, an envelope without an address, without a stamp, with only my name written in a calligraphic, familiar handwriting that instantly threw me back 20 years to the suffocating heat of a student dormitory. I picked it up, my fingers felt the density of the expensive paper, inhaled the faint aroma of old libraries and dust, and even then I realized that this was not business, this was not blackmail, this was something much worse, something that demanded not $1 million, but the integrity of my soul, which I had long considered sold without the right to buy back. Inside was only one sheet, carefully folded in 4, and on it was a single line, written in the same hand, "I know about the river." The river. This word was a code, a password to my personal, carefully walled-up crypt, the name of my greatest sin, my fatal mistake, which had cost me not a fortune, but something much more valuable. After all, only one person, only one, knew about that night, about what had happened on the riverbank 20 years ago, and that was him, my best friend, my idealistic partner, whom I had then, in the heat of ambition, deliberately thrown under a train in order to save my own career, and then watched as his life crumbled to dust. I spent 2 hours in complete paralysis, digesting the fact that the man I thought had died in a car accident 10 years ago, the man whose fake death I had partly financed to ensure his silence and my own safety, was alive, and now, on top of the world, with everything, power, family, an unassailable reputation, he had come back to destroy everything, not for money but for something far more terrible, for pure revenge. I remembered his eyes, filled not with anger but with a deep, unbearable disappointment when he realized my betrayal, and that look, not the $1 million deals, was my real nightmare. My wife, Elizabeth, came down in a silk robe, her beauty, refined and enduring like a fine wine, always calming my inner storms, but this time her presence only increased the sense of imminent disaster, for she did not know the truth about the foundation of our lives. She asked how I was doing, and I replied, with a practiced smile, that everything was fine, but her hand, which touched my shoulder, felt the tension in my muscles, the cold sweat on my skin, and in her eyes, deep and penetrating, I saw a shadow of suspicion that was worse than any accusation. "Are you okay, Adam? You look like you just saw a ghost," she said, and this simple, almost innocent dialogue, full of anxiety and concern, was the final, unbearable blow for me, because I had just realized that the ghost had returned not only to destroy me, but also what I was most afraid of losing, the trust of the only person I truly loved, despite my entire cynical empire. Trying to patch the crack in the foundation of my life was as futile as trying to fill a dam with sand. No sooner had I built one wall of defense than dozens of other jets of chaos erupted around me, and things only got worse with each passing hour of my frantic but covert investigation. I had my security chief, old James, a man with an emotionless face and eyes that had seen too much, conduct the most secret and swift investigation into the possible blackmail, but I could not give him the one key element, the name of my friend, Wayne, because that would have opened the Pandora's box I had kept locked for so long. I tried to act preemptively, using all my resources. I checked old bank accounts, tracked down suspicious transactions, even hired a private investigator to review medical records from the same accident a decade ago, but all I found only confirmed the official version. Wayne was dead, his body cremated, the story closed. But the envelope. This envelope was a living mockery of my power, of my billions, of my carefully constructed facade, and I began to understand that this was not a question of money, this was a question of exposure. The next day, during an important board meeting about the merger that would give me control of the entire continent's energy market, a photograph suddenly appeared on my personal, secure tablet, which had no access to the outside network, an old, faded photo taken on the banks of the river, where Wayne and I, young, naive, not yet corrupted by ambition, were sitting side by side, and in Wayne's hands was the same important document, the original, compromised report on environmental violations. That could have destroyed my first big deal, and which I had then rewritten, putting it under attack, and it was then that I felt the ground slipping from under my feet. I turned off the tablet. My colleagues looked at me in surprise, seeing the cold mask of self-control crack, and only the vice president, John, my long-time, loyal partner, gave me a quick, searching look that pierced through, and in which I read suspicion mixed with almost undisguised triumph. But the real blow came later that evening, when, trying to distract myself, I turned on the evening news and saw the headlines that flashed across the screen like a verdict: Scandal, Artemis Group's 10-year falsification of environmental reports, expert test confirms authenticity of leaked documents. This was not just a leak, it was a targeted assassination of my reputation, and behind it stood a hand that knew where to strike most painfully, because the publication of these documents would not only destroy the deal, it would call into question the very foundation of my wealth, my honest first billions. That was the first time I felt the physical pain of loss. It wasn't the loss of money, but the loss of the irreversible ability to control my own narrative. When I got home, Elizabeth was waiting for me, not with reassurance, but with a cold, stony emptiness in her eyes, holding in her hands a printed copy of the same compromising report that Wayne had leaked to me, the same one that I had destroyed, and then I realized that this was not just revenge, it was betrayal, because only someone in her inner circle could find this report. "You didn't betray me, Adam," she whispered, her voice more destructive than any anger. "You betrayed that young person you pretended to be." And at that moment I lost everything, my reputation, the billions that began to rapidly melt on the stock exchange, and, most importantly, I lost her faith, and this loss was not just a break for me, but a complete, irreversible fall into the abyss, because for the first time in a long time I felt not the master of the world, but a defenseless outcast. When the world you spent 30 years building turns against you and the walls of your penthouse become prison walls, all that remains is the realization of the fragility of power, which has always been an illusion, sustained by the silence of others. My life has become a continuous flight. I have lost the trust of investors, my wife has left, taking with her not diamonds or fortune, but the part of my conscience that was still stinging, and the media attack has reached its apogee, turning my name into a synonym for corruption. I was sitting in my now empty office, going through old files, trying to find some clue that would explain how Wayne had not only survived but also been able to access documents that I had thought were forever destroyed, when my gaze fell on a small, barely visible mark on the back of one of the original copies of the environmental report, a small, hieroglyphic symbol that could only belong to one person from my past. It was Maria, Wayne's former secretary, a quiet, inconspicuous woman who, as I remembered, had always looked at me with a mixture of disgust and fear, but who had never betrayed Wayne, despite my attempts to motivate her. I found her, which turned out to be surprisingly easy. She lived modestly, working as a librarian in a small coastal town, far from the hustle and bustle of the metropolis, and it was there, in a dusty reading room, amidst a silence more deafening than the noise of Wall Street, that we met. She greeted me without surprise, as if she knew this moment was inevitable. Her face, plowed with lines, seemed carved from stone. "Are you here for the truth, Adam, or for salvation?" she asked, her voice low and husky, like the whisper of an old record, and then I realized that she was my unexpected ally, or my executioner, but she knew everything. I put the compromised photo on the table, the one that had appeared on my tablet. The river. And this symbol. "You helped him, didn't you? You saved these documents." Maria just sighed, and the sound was so tired and sad that my own feelings seemed petty and selfish. "I didn't help him survive, Adam. I helped him disappear. Wayne knew you would shut him up sooner or later. He wasn't afraid of death at your hands, he was afraid of living in your shadow, knowing you betrayed him for papers. The real Wayne died that night on the river when you turned your back." She took out a small metal flash drive from the old book, hidden between the pages. "He didn't want to destroy you, Adam. He wanted you to realize. This flash drive doesn't contain evidence of your guilt, it's already in print. Here is the full, unedited report on the environmental disaster we covered up then, the one that cost him his life and the one that's still destroying the little town. He wanted you to know that in saving your million, you killed not only him, but thousands of people who drink that water. This was forbidden knowledge that turned the world upside down, not only for my business, but for my morality. I had always thought my sin was betraying a friend, but it turned out that I was responsible for thousands of accidents and deaths, and this realization was so powerful and physically painful that I almost passed out right there in the library. Maria looked at me, and there was no hatred in her eyes, only pity. Your return was his last act. He died a year ago. Of cancer. Caused, he believed, by the same river. But before he died, he asked me to convey this to you when you were at the peak of your decline. Wayne believed that only then would you be ready to listen. I held the flash drive in my hand, it was as heavy as my unpardoned sin, and I realized that his revenge was not to take my money, but to force me to accept an unbearable truth, and now I had a choice: use this knowledge to save thousands, or destroy it to save myself from life imprisonment. The forbidden knowledge stored on a tiny flash drive burned my palm harder than any fire, and I sat in a rented, anonymous apartment, listening to the night rain patter on the glass, realizing that this was the only, true choice in my life that could not be bought, could not be postponed, and could not be shifted onto someone else's shoulders. An analysis I conducted that night with the help of one of my old, trusted but now frightened loyalists confirmed my worst fears. The data on the flash drive was indisputable evidence, not only of an environmental disaster caused by my company years ago, but also that the problem had been actively covered up for years, and that the conspiracy reached the highest echelons of government and business, including John, my vice president, who was behind the leak of the old documents to take my place. Unaware of the existence of a real, deadly bomb, I was faced with an abyss. On the one hand, to become Adam Thorne again, the one who knows how to win, destroy the flash drive, expose John in a conspiracy, use his leak as a smokescreen for his rehabilitation, save the remnants of his fortune and regain at least part of his reputation, paying with silence for hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. On the other hand, to publish the full report, reveal the whole truth about the river, about his betrayal, about corruption at the highest level, thereby guaranteeing himself not only bankruptcy and the total collapse of the empire, but also life imprisonment for environmental crime and concealment of evidence, but at the same time giving hope for salvation and justice to thousands of innocent people. It was a choice not between wealth and poverty, but between hypocritical self-preservation and an act of terrible but necessary repentance. I remembered Maria's words, her regret, not anger, and I remembered Elizabeth's look, her deep disappointment in my young man, and I realized that the only thing left of my old life was not money, but this opportunity to redeem myself, not Wayne. I made up my mind. I couldn't beat John at his own dirty game, I had to beat Adam Thorne as I was. I called John to meet me, not in the office, but in a dilapidated, old factory building, away from eavesdropping and prying eyes, a place that reminded me of the dirty beginnings of my business, where we could talk without masks. When John arrived, his face was aglow with anticipation of victory, his arrogant smile a perfect illustration of my cynicism. I'm glad you gave up, Adam. It was just a matter of time. You've always been too sentimental for this business. Let's discuss the terms of your departure before I bring this garbage to light. I placed the flash drive on the rusty metal table, and it sparkled in the light of the single bulb. You think you won, John? You leaked an old report. But you forgot the real story. The real story is not my money. The real story is the river and the people who are dying there. His face instantly went white, his stardom gone, replaced by animal fear, because he realized that I didn't just have evidence, I had a real, explosive secret that would destroy them all. You wouldn't dare. This is the end of everything. Our reputation, our money, our freedom. You can't risk it like that, he hissed, and I felt a strange, unfamiliar calm as I watched his fear. It's all or nothing, John. And I'll take nothing if that nothing saves even one life. I'm risking everything because I've lost everything that was important, and the only thing left is the opportunity to do one honest thing. I turned on the live broadcast on one of the independent news channels I had arranged with, and, taking a deep breath, began my confession, exposing not only John and the corporate conspiracy, but also my own, irreversible guilt, exposing my name and my freedom to the whole world. The floodlights that suddenly flared up in the dim light of the old factory were blinding, and the voices of the reporters who burst in after my confession sounded like the roar of an angry swarm, but I felt, strangely, not fear or despair, but a relief that was like throwing off a weight I had carried for 20 years, a weight consisting of billions and unrepentant sin. John was arrested, my lawyers froze in panic, not understanding how a billionaire could consciously give up all his leverage and hand over evidence of his own crime, but for me it no longer mattered. I realized that the real gambit was not to avoid punishment, but to accept it, and for the first time in a long time I felt that I was in control of my own destiny, and not just the financial flows. The following weeks were a whirlwind. My name, my business, my life, all were pulverized in the media. My assets were frozen, a criminal case was opened against me, and my ex-wife, Elizabeth, through her lawyer, sent me a message that pierced the armor of my cynicism. Thank you, Adam. Now I know who I loved, even though it's too late. It was not a rebuke but a confession, and it was more valuable than all her diamonds. I realized that an act of atonement, even a devastating one, was the only thing that could restore the human dignity I had trampled on for so long. I spent the last day before the trial looking at an old photo of Wayne that Maria had left me, a photo of him smiling with that childlike innocence I had killed in him. I didn't ask him for forgiveness because I knew that forgiveness could only be earned through action. Thanks to my confession, a large-scale program to clean up the river was launched, and the affected communities gained access to clean water and medical care, and this fact was greater for me than any acquittal. In the pretrial detention cell, where the walls were bare and the only sound was the beating of my own heart, I felt truly free for the first time. My philosophical realization was simple and terrifying: wealth is not an achievement, but simply a tool that only strengthens the moral essence of the one who owns it. My billions only accelerated my downfall, because they allowed me to hide my crime from the world, but not from myself. I was sentenced to a long prison term, and I accepted this decision without protest. As I left the courtroom, through the crowd of journalists, I met Maria's gaze, who nodded faintly, and this was my only, real justification. Is it possible to be rich and honest? I answered that question by choosing honesty over wealth. Which was more important, truth or success? I chose truth, because success without it was just empty scenery. Maybe Wayne, my message between the stars, had returned not to seek revenge but to give me a second chance at a life that wasn't just a long, luxurious lie. My story didn't end at the top of a skyscraper, but at the beginning of a long road to redemption, and I didn't know if I could redeem the past, but I knew that for the first time in my life I was trying to live, not just exist.